So it's great to have both of us here, actually. It's very rare that the energy efficiency team and WEO team are on the same panel. Essentially, I'll do a kind of state of play for energy efficiency, and then Ellie will be looking forward, as the word outlook indicates in the WEO. So here's our report, Energy Efficiency 2017. It's part of our market report series. It's the 5th year now that we've been running it, and if you see at the bottom there, it's free to download. So go and download it. If I was to give you an elevator pitch for the 3 key messages out of it, first of all, 2016 confirmed the recent step up in efficiency gains that we've seen this decade. And this is generating huge economic, social, and environmental impacts, and we do some decomposition analysis that enables us to show that. But there is a dark cloud on the horizon. Stronger policy implementation is essential. We, for the first time, have a sort of quantitative measure of new policy implementation globally this year, and we see that in 2016, there was very little new policy implementation, new policy coming into force, despite the promises that have been made in the NDCs, for example. So we're hoping that's just a blip, but we see this as a bit of a dark cloud on the horizon. So what's our headline measure? Well, at the global level, we're measuring primary energy intensity, and we can see on the left-hand side of the chart here 3 decadal averages from the 80s, 90s, and noughties, and you can see that over those 3 decades, energy intensity at a global level was improving at about 1.3% per annum. Since 2010, it's been running at about 2.1% per annum. 2016, not particularly stellar compared to 2015, but one shouldn't read too much into annual variations in this measure, which is affected by some randomness, including the weather. But once we look at 6 years in a row, I think it's important to register that this is the first time we've seen 6 consecutive years of 1.8% or more gains in energy intensity. And that's going back to the early 1970s, for which we have data. Now, one of the stories we've been running with in the IEA over the last few years has been the flattening of CO2 or energy-related CO2 emissions. So after decades of growth in annual CO2 emissions, between 2014 and 2016, emissions have remained pretty flat, and we do a little decomposition of that using energy intensity. And so here's our 2014 emissions, cut off at 28 here. And we can see some of the factors that are affecting the change in emissions. So GDP growth, economic activity, that's pushing up emissions. Changes in the fuel mix, so that's more renewables, less coal, for example, is dragging it down. But by far the most important factor here has been the improvement in energy intensity over that 3-year period. Now, this is a statistical analysis. It's not an econometric analysis. It is more complicated than that. And in fact, efficiency and the fuel mix are supporting each other. They're complementary here. So if you think about more renewables in the mix, that's actually going to improve primary energy intensity. And at the same time, energy intensity improving is enabling, particularly in China, a reduction in energy demand at the margin, and at the margin, coal is the fuel that is used in China. So that helps to improve the percentage of renewables in the fuel mix. And if we look at the EU's performance in absolute terms, in terms of energy intensity, because I know that the next session is about is the EU lagging behind? Well, compared to some of the other big economic blocs, well, the EU 28 does have the lowest energy intensity of its GDP, alongside Japan there at the bottom. And you can see the performance of China over the last few years dramatically reducing its energy intensity, albeit from a very high starting point. Now, but anybody who knows anything about energy efficiency will know that energy intensity is not a brilliant proxy for energy efficiency. It's not bad at the global level, where it's less important sort of changes in industrial structure between countries. But once we start looking at individual countries, it's really important, if you can, to try and isolate the impact of energy efficiency from some of the other factors that affect energy consumption. So we do that in our IEA member countries, so that's most of the EU, some other European countries, US, Canada, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So essentially developed world countries. And we also have 6 major emerging economies for which we have enough data to do this. So that's India, Indonesia, China, Brazil, Mexico, and the Russian Federation. That's on the right. And here we can see energy consumption, TFC now, so we're in final consumption in 2000. IEA member countries, and if we say how much would energy consumption have increased had it not been for energy efficiency, so isolating that efficiency effect, and we can see that energy consumption in our IEA countries would have increased by about 13%. But with energy efficiency, we see that actually energy consumption is now at a level we last saw in 1999. Now, the major emerging economies, of course, a very different story. Energy consumption would have more than doubled had it not been for efficiency. The efficiency effect actually fairly similar in those major emerging economies. It's reducing energy consumption, again, by 13%. Now, what does that mean for consumers? So we do our decomposition at end-use level. So if we look at now residential consumption of electricity and natural gas and transport fuel, and we can see that as a result of the efficiency gains made over the period between 2000 and 2016, in 2016, households were saving these amounts in these countries that we've analysed. So this is per capita, by the way. So we can see that in these Western European countries, Germany, France, United Kingdom, and also in Japan, we've seen savings of roughly about 30% on their energy consumption of electricity, natural gas and transport fuel. And as a result of Germany's particularly high residential electricity prices, the German consumers are saving the most amount of money here, $580 per person. In the US here, we see only $140. That's partly a function of slightly fewer savings, but it's also a function of the fact that the American consumer, on average, consumes about twice as much of energy as a consumer in Germany. So actually 10% of a much larger amount is still a fair efficiency gain, and of course the much lower prices that Americans are facing. So they're saving about $140 per person. In China, it's $60, but we can see here they're saving about 25% compared to what they would have consumed had there been no energy efficiency. And the reason that's so low, it's partly relatively low energy prices, but it's also partly the low starting position. So each Chinese consumer consumes considerably less energy in the first place before we look at the impact of energy efficiency. However, what we can see is here that consumers are making some significant gains as a result of the efficiency gains that we've seen since 2000. Now, in the report this year, we also did a bit of a deep dive on energy security. So each year we've looked at impact on imports. This time, though, we went a bit deeper and looked at impact on peak gas consumption. So what we did was we went and found the days in Germany, United Kingdom, and France, and found and looked at on which day was gas consumption highest. And this is correlated very much with cold weather. So this was in 2012 in Germany, in 2010 in the UK, and 2012 in France. And we said, well, this is how much gas was being consumed in cubic meters. So around about between 350 and 550 cubic meters during that particular day. And we compared that to a measure of energy security, which is called the N-1 requirement. Now, does anybody know what the N-1 requirement is? Okay, we've got one hand up. Well, it is an EU requirement. So in order to have adequate gas security, you need to have enough supply so that if one of your key pieces of infrastructure was knocked out, so like a storage facility or a pipeline, you'd still have enough capacity to meet the need on that peak day. So here's the N-1 supply requirement, and we can see that Germany was comfortably inside it, United Kingdom and France relatively close to that N-1 requirement. And if we now look at what the gas consumption would have been had there not been energy efficiency, we can see that, well, Germany would still be fine. Perhaps they've overinvested in gas infrastructure, I don't know. But in the United Kingdom and France, looks like they're being fairly economically rational. But if there hadn't been energy efficiency, they'd have needed to invest more, essentially, in their security infrastructure. Now, what about investment? Well, this now looks at energy efficiency investment, and we can see that between 2015 and 2016, it increased by 9%, and the biggest driver of that was in China. However, if we look at that by sector, we can see that the building sector is actually the biggest consumer of investment, and the majority of that investment is actually in Europe, with Germany leading the way here. Now, it's important to look at buildings investment and think about, well, what impact might that have had on our efficiency outcomes? Now, I can't actually draw any firm conclusions about that, but what I can show you is just what our efficiency effect is in the EU by sector. So here is the total energy efficiency effect. It comes in at about 17–18% in the EU. So essentially that's saying roughly that energy consumption would have been about 18% higher had it not been for energy efficiency. And here we can see the commercial sector, so that's industry services, and we can see that roughly tracks it. Here, though, is the residential sector. And we can see that this is the sector that outperforms all the others in the EU. So perhaps that's a function of the greater investment in energy efficiency in the residential sector in the EU. What about the sectors that are lagging behind, though? Well, indeed. So here's passenger transport. Now, that seems a bit odd, doesn't it, given that we've got this great policy, the CO2, gram CO2 per kilometre policy. Well, perhaps we need to look at the gap between the target measures and the real world on the road performance. And I know that the EU is looking at that issue. Passenger transport, though, we have seen an improvement. Here's the bad boy of the class. So this is freight transport. And we can see that since 2000, the efficiency effect in the freight transport sector has been zero, essentially, or even negative in the last few years. So that tells us something about perhaps where the policy focus should be. Let's look at that a little bit in more detail. So here we can see how global oil demand has increased by 16 million barrels per day between 2000 and 2015, and transport has been the overwhelmingly responsible sector for that. 80% of the increase is owing to increase in transport demand. Now you might think, well, passenger vehicles surely must be the main culprit here. We've seen a doubling of cars on the road globally since 2000. There are over 1 billion cars now on the road, whereas there are only 60 million trucks. However, trucks actually have consumed the largest share of that increase, and that's despite the fact that only 60 million trucks. But of course, trucks drive a lot more. Most trucks are mostly driven throughout their economic life. They do about 100,000 kilometers per year, as opposed to 15,000 for a car. And of course, per kilometre, they consume a lot more fuel, 40 litres as opposed to 5 to 10 for a passenger vehicle. So trucks, really important for oil demand and all the things that go with it. But policy coverage is much, much lower for trucks. What do I mean by policy coverage? What I'm talking about here are mandatory policies, things like the gram CO2 per kilometre target in the EU, corporate average fuel economy targets, standards in the US and many other countries around the world. And we can see for cars, that coverage is about 55–56%. What we mean by that is that 56% of the energy that's consumed by cars globally is being consumed by cars that were bought under policies such as those types of standards. So if you bought a car in the EU in 2000, that wouldn't be covered, but if you bought it in 2010, it would be covered. So 56% of global energy is now covered by these types of standards, and actually about 40 countries, just under 40 countries have now got these types of standards. On the right-hand side, we can see the trucks coverage, only 16%, and there are only 4 countries in the world that do have standards on trucks. China, the US, Japan, who led the way, and Canada, who introduced theirs alongside the US. So we know that the EU is working in this area, but clearly this is an area that, Niels, 4 minutes. Right, okay. So looking more broadly now at these types of mandatory policies, and now we're going to broaden it out beyond the vehicle sector to minimum energy performance standards for appliances, building codes, industry targets that are mandatory, industry sector targets. And we see that the energy coverage of those policies has been increasing every single year from about 24% in 2012 to almost 32% in 2016. So this is where, well, on the face of it, that looks pretty good, but there's still 68% that's uncovered, and our dark cloud on the horizon is that of these increases, we can see in some years, the blue bit here is owing to, the blue bit here is owing to existing policies, the green bit to new policies. What I mean by that is that if you bought a new car tomorrow, it would be covered by a pre-existing policy. So the increase in coverage would be blue. But if someone in Indonesia was to buy an air conditioner this year, that would be green because Indonesia introduced a new air conditioner standard in 2016. In 2016, that little green bit is 1% of this increase. Absolutely tiny. So we think that, and in fact, air conditioners in Indonesia, chillers in China were the only two new significant standards that were brought in 2016. So new coverage has slowed down, and we'd like to see that ramp up again, including in the EU with trucks. We also look in the report at coverage of energy utility obligations, so a different type of mandatory policy now. We had to look at it differently because of these things cover the same sectors that a lot of the minimum energy performance standards cover, and we see that the amount of energy being consumed by energy consumers whose utility is obligated to deliver some energy savings has increased from about 7% in 2015 in 2005 to about 18% in 2016. Again, we didn't see any increase in the coverage here in 2016. There were no new policies introduced, although we have seen in 2017 some new ones in Europe. And in fact, Europe is leading the way in terms of new obligations and indeed increasing the strength of those obligations over time. Now, finally, of course, energy efficiency progress isn't just about mandatory policies, and it's not just about policy, it's also about industry, for example, taking action. And we tracked for the first time this year the uptake of ISO 50001 certificates by region and country. So this is, as I'm sure you all know, energy management system. And so this is about attacking the sort of wider system energy efficiency gains that can be made in industrial processes beyond the gains that can be made from simply having standards on industrial motors. So there's been about 12,000 certifications, 85% of those in Europe. So again, Europe leading the way. Why is that? Well, we should look at Germany. And in Germany, the reason why it's been so high is because it's policy driven. So there's a tax break there for companies that can show they're ISO 50001 certified. Interesting footnote, actually France has the highest number of sites that are certified, and that's because a couple of their supermarket chains have gone ISO 50001 compliant. So Carrefour, for example, that's bumping up the number of sites. So just a few concluding remarks. So the report shows the critical importance of energy efficiency to economies, households, businesses, and the environment. There has been a step up in efficiency gains in recent years, and that's despite lower energy prices, and it's having many positive impacts. However, governments must renew their focus on policy implementation and attacking the 68% of energy use that's not covered by mandatory efficiency standards, and indeed strengthening the existing ones. However, energy management is central to unlocking the system-wide efficiency gains needed if deeper savings are to be made. And with all this new coverage that we need to be looking to see, the IEA is ready to assist countries to meet all that unrealized energy efficiency potential, and we're certainly ramping up our efforts, particularly with our emerging economies through our Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies program going forward. So thank you very much, and with that, I will hand back to Niels, who's going to introduce the next speaker.